In January of 1944, General Omar Bradley found himself within a Quonset hut situated south of Bristol. He observed British engineers as they elucidated their ambitious scheme to construct two entire artificial harbors and then transport them across the English Channel. This concept, dubbed Mulberry Harbour, envisioned each port to be the size of Dover's existing harbour, assembled from hundreds of immense concrete caissons, some towering as high as 5-story structures. Bradley, a straightforward man from Missouri, who had previously led troops in North Africa and Sicily, listened with his arms folded. When the presentation concluded, he turned to his aide and voiced what many American officers were privately considering. The British have lost their minds. Yet he did not depart, nor did any of the other American generals present. This was because, by the early months of 1944, American commanders arriving in Britain to prepare for the invasion of France were encountering something entirely unforeseen. The British, after enduring 4 years of conflict, had cultivated a methodology for military operations that was simultaneously brilliant yet perplexing, meticulously thorough yet maddeningly slow, and innovative to a degree the Americans had never conceived, yet so painstakingly cautious it nearly drove the more aggressive American leaders to distraction. This is the narrative of their pronouncements upon witnessing these preparations, detailing their documented reactions, their concealed frustrations, their reluctant acknowledgments of merit, and the ultimate esteem that blossomed between allies who approached warfare from fundamentally divergent perspectives. For the preparations for D-Day were not solely about assembling an invasion force. They represented the collision of two distinct military cultures, a process of mutual learning, and the eventual forging of what would become the most intricate military undertaking in human history. General Dwight Eisenhower had arrived in Britain in June of 1942, with the mandate to command American forces in Europe. By the time he was appointed Supreme Allied Commander for Operation Overlord in December of 1943, he had spent 18 months observing the British at work. His initial impressions of British military culture were characterized by diplomatic bewilderment. The British planning process appeared to involve an unending series of meetings, countless servings of tea, and a level of detailed preparation that struck American officers as bordering on an inability to act. However, Eisenhower was beginning to discern the underlying rationale. In a correspondence to General George Marshall in February of 1944, he remarked that the British possessed an infinite capacity for taking pains. This statement was neither entirely complimentary nor a direct complaint. It was an observation from a leader striving to comprehend allies whose entire approach to warfare had been molded by experiences Americans had not shared. The British had experienced the evacuation from Dunkirk, endured the relentless bombing of the Blitz, and fought in North Africa for 3 years before American forces joined the fray. They had learned, through harsh and costly experience, that insufficient preparation invariably led to catastrophic losses. The Americans, in contrast, brought an abundance of confidence, at times bordering on overconfidence. They possessed an industrial capacity that Britain could only dream of, fresh troops eager for combat, and a cultural inclination towards decisive, aggressive action. When American generals arrived to inspect the British preparations for the invasion, the disparity in their styles was immediately apparent. General George Patton, then commanding the Third Army and stationed in England as part of the elaborate deception plan intended to mislead the Germans regarding the invasion's true landing site, made no attempt to conceal his exasperation. In his personal diary in March of 1944, he wrote about British prudence with barely concealed disdain. After attending a planning session where British officers deliberated extensive preparations for potential setbacks, Patton scrawled, "They plan for defeat before they plan for victory." This was intended as a harsh criticism. Conversely, British officers perusing similar American assessments would have thought, "They haven't suffered defeat yet. They don't comprehend the true cost of failure." Yet even Patton, for all his bluster, discovered aspects that commanded his admiration. During a visit to British commando training installations in Scotland, he observed men practicing with specialized equipment and meticulously rehearsing complex amphibious assaults with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. In a letter to his wife, he admitted, "These British commandos are tough as woodpecker lips. They train as if they expect to fight the devil himself." It was the specialized equipment that evoked some of the most memorable American reactions. Major General Percy Hobart, a recognized British tank authority, had developed an entire menagerie of modified armored vehicles for the invasion. These included tanks capable of swimming, tanks designed to detonate mines by flailing the ground with chains, tanks that could deploy bridges or lay down a path over soft sand, and tanks equipped to launch massive bunker-busting mortars. American officers bestowed upon these vehicles the affectionate yet somewhat skeptical nickname, Hobart's Funnies, a moniker that perfectly captured their initial response of amused disbelief. Bradley himself witnessed demonstrations of these vehicles in March of 1944. He watched a Sherman tank, outfitted with a flotation screen and propellers, successfully traverse a lake. He also observed another tank vigorously churning the ground ahead of it with rotating chains, intentionally detonating mines. His initial reaction, documented in his memoir, was one of doubt. The British, he wrote, had a solution for every problem, including problems that did not exist. The American military culture favored direct, uncomplicated solutions. A swimming tank was deemed unnecessary if sufficient landing craft were available to deliver tanks directly to the beach. A mine-flailing tank was superfluous if combat engineers could clear mines using established, conventional methods. However, Bradley was also a pragmatist. Following the demonstrations, he inquired of the British officers about casualty projections, both with and without the deployment of this specialized equipment. The figures presented were stark. The deployment of swimming tanks meant armor support would be present on the beach in the initial assault wave, rather than arriving later in the third or fourth wave. The mine-clearing tanks signified that infantry could advance without the protracted delay of engineers painstakingly clearing each meter of terrain by hand. While Bradley did not wholeheartedly endorse all of Hobart's funnies, he did authorize American units to utilize some of them. This represented a compromise that encapsulated the entirety of the Allied relationship. Americans, while skeptical, were willing to learn. The British, drawing on their extensive experience, required American resources. The Mulberry Harbors, however, proved more challenging for the Americans to accept. The concept was so audacious It verged on the fantastical, because the invasion could not guarantee the immediate capture of a functional port. The British proposed constructing artificial harbors in England, towing them across the channel in sections, and then submerging them into position off the coast of Normandy. Each harbor was to feature breakwaters constructed from sunken ships and enormous concrete caissons, interconnected by floating roadways known as whale bridges, and supported by pierheads capable of adjusting to the dramatic 20-foot tidal variations. American engineers considered the undertaking impossible. Captain Edward Elberg, a United States Navy salvage expert who reviewed the plans, confided to his colleagues that the concrete caissons would likely disintegrate in the fierce channel storms. Army engineers calculated that the construction of these components would necessitate more steel and concrete than Britain could reasonably allocate. Even if the harbors could be successfully built, the prospect of towing them across the channel and assembling them under constant threat of German fire seemed like an engineering fantasy. Nevertheless, Eisenhower overruled the doubters. During a meeting in February of 1944, he listened as American engineers enumerated their objections, then interrupted them forcefully. "The British," he declared, "have been contemplating amphibious operations while we were still figuring out which end of the rifle to hold. If they state it can be accomplished, we are going to assist them in doing so." This was Eisenhower at his finest, displaying enough diplomacy to acknowledge the British experience, while simultaneously being blunt enough to end further debate. The sheer scale of the British preparations impressed even the most skeptical Americans. By April of 1944, southern England had transformed into an enormous military encampment. American generals touring the staging areas observed a level of British organization that made their own preparations appear almost haphazard. Every unit possessed detailed maps and scale models of the designated landing zones. Each soldier had received thorough briefings on precisely what they were expected to encounter. British planners had meticulously crafted plaster models of the Normandy coastline so astonishingly accurate that soldiers could commit terrain features to memory before ever setting foot on the actual beaches. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, who commanded the First Army alongside Bradley, wrote to a colleague after inspecting the British staging areas, "They've considered everything except what to do if the channel disappears." This remark, intended humorously, conveyed genuine astonishment. The British had contingency plans for their plans, backup plans for their backup plans, and contingency plans for unforeseen eventualities that no one had even conceived. However, it was the deception operations that truly astounded American commanders when they were briefed on the full extent of their complexity. Operation Fortitude, the elaborate scheme designed to persuade the Germans that the invasion would target the Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy, stood as the most extensive military deception operation in history. The British had fabricated an entire fictional army group, complete with fabricated radio transmissions, dummy equipment, and even General Patton designated as its supposed commander. They had recruited double agents to feed misleading intelligence to German operatives. They had constructed inflatable tanks and landing craft that appeared entirely authentic when viewed from German reconnaissance aircraft. When Bradley received his comprehensive briefing on Operation Fortitude in March of 1944, his reaction was meticulously recorded by an aide. He remained silent for several minutes before exclaiming, "Jesus Christ, they've thought of everything." The success of the British deception operations stemmed from their understanding of a principle that Americans were still in the process of learning. Modern warfare was not merely about direct combat. It was fundamentally about the manipulation of information, about skillfully guiding the enemy's perception to align with one's own objectives. General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, maintained perhaps the most complex relationship with British operational methods. Smith, affectionately known as Beetle, bore the responsibility of coordinating Allied operations, which necessitated daily collaboration with British staff officers. Within his personal papers, his palpable frustration is evident. British planning meetings frequently extended for hours, filled with exhaustive discussions of details that seemed utterly insignificant to American officers. The volume of British paperwork was legendary. Every operation demanded written orders that appeared to expand with each successive draft. Yet Smith also recognized the profound significance that this documentation represented. In a memo to Eisenhower penned in April of 1944, he articulated, "The British commit everything to writing, because they have learned that when things go wrong, which they invariably do, having a clear written plan ensures that everyone understands their assigned responsibilities before chaos erupts." We Americans tend to improvise. They prefer meticulous preparation. Neither approach is inherently wrong, but ours results in more casualties during the initial hours, and theirs sometimes means we do not engage in combat at all. This assessment might be considered the most insightful observation offered by any American officer regarding the disparities between the Allied forces. The British engaged in exhaustive planning because they had personally experienced the severe consequences of improvisation. Americans, conversely, improvised with confidence because they had not yet endured such a profound cost. The extensive rehearsals underscored both the strengths and the weaknesses inherent in British preparation. Exercise Tiger, conducted in late April of 1944, was intended to be a full-scale simulation of the Utah beach landings. American troops practiced their assault on the English coast, while British naval forces provided crucial support. The exercise, however, proved to be a catastrophic failure. German E-boats launched a surprise attack on the convoy, resulting in the sinking of 2 LSTs and the tragic loss of over 700 American soldiers and sailors. This event constituted the most severe Allied disaster in the English Channel prior to D-Day itself. American commanders were quick to assign blame to inadequate naval protection, while British commanders pointed to American failures in adhering to established communication protocols. However, the ensuing recriminations revealed a deeper underlying difference in their operational philosophies. Bradley, upon visiting the survivors, was struck by the distinct manner in which British officers responded to the disaster. They immediately convened boards of inquiry, meticulously documented every perceived failure, and rigorously revised their procedures. American officers, conversely, seemed more inclined to assign blame and then promptly move forward. In his memoir, Bradley reflected on the events of Exercise Tiger with uncharacteristic introspection. "The British taught us something profoundly important that day," he wrote. "They demonstrated that rehearsals are intended to expose problems, not to confirm readiness. We desired the rehearsal to be a success. They sought for it to educate us on what could go awry. They were correct." As D-Day drew nearer, American generals found themselves progressively adopting more British methods than they had initially anticipated. This included the meticulous planning, the exhaustive briefings, the utilization of specialized equipment, the sophisticated deception operations, and even a newfound caution regarding potential casualties. Eisenhower, in particular, underwent a significant evolution in his thinking. By May of 1944, he was advocating for the very kind of detailed preparation that he had previously deemed excessive 18 months prior. Nevertheless, the fundamental cultural differences never entirely dissipated. On June 5, 1944, the day preceding the invasion, Eisenhower visited both British and American units preparing for embarkation. The British soldiers were notably quiet and intensely focused, methodically checking their equipment with unwavering precision. In stark contrast, the American soldiers exhibited a more boisterous demeanor, their nervous energy manifesting in loud jokes designed to alleviate tension. Eisenhower observed this marked difference and commented to his naval aide, Captain Harry Butcher. "The British," he remarked, "prepare as if they are going to a funeral. We prepare as if we are going to a football game. Both, I suppose, get you ready to face death." The ultimate test, arguably, arrived on June 6th. The Mulberry harbors, whose feasibility had been questioned by American engineers, were successfully towed across the channel and assembled. Although one harbor was ultimately destroyed by a storm weeks later, the other remained operational until Cherbourg was captured, diligently processing thousands of tons of vital supplies each day. The swimming tanks, once derided by Americans as mere funnies, provided indispensable armor support on the British and Canadian beaches during the crucial initial assault waves. The deception operations, which had seemed almost too elaborate to be credible, proved highly effective in convincing German commanders to retain critical divisions at the Pas de Calais for several weeks following the invasion. And the detailed planning, which had initially frustrated American officers with its perceived excessiveness, meant that when unforeseen issues arose, as they inevitably did, commanders possessed a clear understanding of their assigned roles and could adapt effectively from a position of knowledge rather than confusion. Bradley's assessment, written months after D-Day, accurately captured the transformation in American thinking. "We arrived in Britain believing we would teach the British how to fight aggressively," he recalled. "Instead, they instructed us on the importance of thorough preparation. The invasion succeeded because we combined American drive with British meticulousness. Neither approach alone would have been sufficient." Perhaps the most revealing reaction, however, came from Patton himself. Despite his public pronouncements regarding British caution, he penned a telling entry in his diary on June 7th as initial reports from Normandy began to filter in. His Third Army remained in England, held in reserve as part of the overarching deception strategy, and he was frustrated at missing the initial assault. Nevertheless, he wrote, "The British were correct on one point. You cannot improvise an invasion. You can only prepare for it and then execute. Montgomery's painstaking planning may drive me to distraction, but it resulted in more men surviving those beaches alive than my aggressive instincts would have achieved." This represented the closest Patton ever came to acknowledging the merits of the British approach, and it illuminated something significant about the nature of the Allied relationship. American and British generals never fully reached a complete consensus on the optimal conduct of warfare. American officers generally remained more inclined towards aggression, more willing to accept higher casualties in pursuit of swifter advances. British officers, conversely, tended to maintain a more cautious stance, prioritizing the minimization of losses. The inherent tension between these divergent approaches never truly vanished. However, by the time of D-Day, American generals had come to view British preparations not as excessive timidity, but as hard-won wisdom. The British had been engaged in combat for a longer duration. They had experienced setbacks and made errors that the Americans had not yet encountered. Their extensive preparations, which initially seemed almost obsessive to the fresh eyes of American leadership, were the direct outcome of 4 years of learning precisely what methods were effective and which resulted in unnecessary loss of life. In a letter to General Marshall, penned several weeks after D-Day, Eisenhower eloquently summarized the overarching lesson. "The British taught us that preparation is not the antithesis of aggression," he wrote. "Rather, it is the foundation upon which aggression becomes possible. One cannot advance effectively without a clear understanding of one's destination, the challenges one will face, and a comprehensive plan for managing situations when initial plans falter. We provided the drive, they delivered the discipline. Together, we successfully deployed an army into France." The Mulberry Harbors, the swimming tanks, the sophisticated deception operations, the exhaustive planning, the detailed briefings, and the specialized equipment. All of these elements had initially appeared either excessive, impossible, or far too clever when American generals first encountered them. Yet all of them ultimately proved successful. Not perfectly, for perfection is a rare commodity in warfare, but sufficiently effective to enable hundreds of thousands of men to cross the most heavily fortified coastline in Europe and establish a foothold that could not be dislodged back into the sea. The American generals who had arrived in Britain harboring skepticism towards British methodologies departed with a profound respect for an ally who had learned, through years of bitter experience, the intricate art of preparing for the chaos of combat. They did not adopt every single British tactic. American military culture remained distinct, characterized by greater assertiveness, a stronger inclination towards improvisation, and a higher tolerance for risk. However, they did learn a crucial lesson, that preparation and aggression were not opposing forces, but rather indispensable partners. When Bradley returned to the United States following the war, he was questioned about Allied cooperation. His response, while diplomatic, was nonetheless revealing. "We taught the British to punch harder," he stated. "They taught us to aim better. The combination secured victory." While not entirely literal, this sentiment captured something vital about the transformation that occurred when American generals witnessed the British preparations for D-Day. They observed an ally who had mastered the conduct of war through the crucible of painful experience. They saw methods that, while unconventional, were firmly rooted in hard-learned lessons. They recognized an ally who planned with obsessive detail because they intimately understood the devastating cost of improvisation. They witnessed the construction of artificial harbors because they grasped the strategic importance of logistics in winning wars. They saw the deployment of swimming tanks because they had learned that early armor support on the beach could significantly preserve infantry lives. They observed elaborate deception schemes because they knew that misinformation could prove as lethal as direct firepower. American generals had initially arrived in Britain brimming with confidence in their own established methods. They departed with a deep-seated respect for an ally whose operational approaches, though different, were equally valid and effective. This mutual respect, this willingness to learn from one another despite inherent cultural disparities and occasional personal friction, proved to be as critical to the success of D-Day as any harbor, any tank, or any battle plan. The preparations for D-Day transcended the mere assembly of an invasion force. They represented two nations learning the complex art of fighting in concert, effectively blending America's formidable industrial might and assertive spirit with Britain's extensive experience and unwavering meticulousness. The initial skepticism harbored by American generals towards British preparations evolved into a reluctant admiration and ultimately into genuine respect. This shift was not born from a wholesale adoption of every British tactic, but from a recognition that their ally had assimilated invaluable lessons, developed indispensable capabilities, and forged an approach to warfare that, when combined with American strengths, could achieve what neither nation could accomplish in isolation. The successful invasion of Normandy was the result of numerous factors. The extraordinary courage displayed by soldiers on the beaches, the decisive air superiority that shielded the landing forces, the powerful naval armada that transported armies across the Channel, and the immense industrial capacity that produced the necessary armaments and equipment all played crucial roles. However, the invasion also succeeded because American and British generals learned to honor and integrate each other's distinct approaches, forging a unified command from their diverse military cultures, and understanding that multiple pathways could lead to victory. When American generals first surveyed Britain's D-Day preparations, they were, in essence, glimpsing the future of warfare. This future was not solely defined by specific technological innovations, but by the underlying principles they embodied. That modern warfare demanded a scale of preparation previously unimaginable. That meticulous attention to detail was paramount. That logistical capabilities dictated strategic possibilities. That deception could wield power equal to brute firepower. And that allies who engaged in mutual learning were inherently stronger than those who merely fought side by side. This constituted the true revelation of what American generals discerned when they observed British D-Day preparations. There wasn't a single definitive utterance or response that marked the shift, but rather a gradual metamorphosis, transitioning from doubt to admiration, from unwavering faith in their own strategies to valuing the sagacity of their partners, and from perceiving divergences as impediments to acknowledging them as assets. The triumph of the Allied forces in Normandy was constructed upon a multitude of cornerstones. Yet one of the paramount pillars was the readiness of the American and British leaders to absorb lessons from one another, to synergize their respective capabilities, and to fashion a cohesive methodology from two distinct military traditions.